This afternoon, we are in for a very wonderful treat. We're going to see the movie The Answer. And for me, this movie is the best depiction of the relationship between guru and disciple that I have ever seen. It shows the deep love between guru and disciple, the way that the guru trains the disciple, the way that the disciple opens himself to the guru. I won't go on more about this because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that means a movie is worth many lectures. So we'll let the movie speak for itself. But the movie covers, as Swami's autobiography, The New Path, covers basically his childhood up to meeting Master and the training that he received from Master. And then he doesn't fill in much more of the story after that. It's as if the important aspect of his life was the preparation for and the meeting with Master and the training under Master. But I thought it would be interesting and perhaps entertaining and helpful if I share my life with Swami in stories, because that's going to show the arc of Swami's life after he left Master. There was only 15 years between when Master passed and when I met Swamiji. I met him Easter Sunday, 1967. I had read the autobiography. Before I met him, he had been with self-realization for 10 years after Master's passing. He had spent 4 of those years, 1958 to 1962, here in India. And then there was a parting of the way with Self-Realization Fellowship. And then after that, Swamiji had a period of about 2 years where he was kind of recovering from that. By the time that I met him in 1967, he had begun teaching and had been teaching for perhaps 2 years by that time. When I say teaching, his primary classes were a 6-week series that was a yoga posture session, Hatha Yoga, about an hour long, and then a break, and then an hour class in what we would call level 1 meditation, how to meditate. And so that series of yoga postures and basic meditation, he would give around the various towns, the cities near San Francisco. He had his home in San Francisco at this time. And I had read the autobiography of a yogi, and a few months after that, we learned, my brother-in-law and I learned, that Swami, there was a direct disciple of Yogananda living in San Francisco, and we obtained his address. And then, as I say, on Easter Sunday of 1967, we went and simply knocked on the door of this little 1-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. Swami introduced himself, and we introduced ourselves, and many people I've joked, but it's quite serious, and people have repeated it. After we exchanged names, Swami said, "I'm working on a project. Would you like to help?" Now, the project was sending out little flyers for an upcoming class, and in those days you had to take typewriter and type on names or mimeograph that and then put a sticker on the envelope. And so it was a simple little project, and we were happy to help. But I've joked that saying, "Yes, I would like to help with your project," I didn't realize that meant the rest of my life was going to be taken up with that. So that afternoon, and I want to talk about also his discipleship, because even right at the very beginning, by the time that afternoon came about, Easter Sunday, there were about 5 other people there in his apartment helping. And we all went to Golden Gate Park in San Francisco for a picnic. And at that point, Swami did something that he did year after year after year until his passing some 60 years later nearly. And that was that he began talking about Yogananda, Yogananda's teachings, and his time with Yogananda. And he shared some stories of being with Master. Because we were eating a picnic lunch, he looked at the food and he said, "Oh, Master said that food has particular vibrations of consciousness. For instance, the bananas that we're eating, they help produce humility. And these cherries, they help produce joy." And talked a little in that way. And he had his guitar and he sang a couple of songs. And I was utterly charmed. I was immediately I'd never met anyone like this. Never imagined that I was going to meet someone like this. And so the first opportunity that I had, the first time the class was given in San Francisco, and in fact it was probably those flyers that we were sending out, I took that 6-week class. But because at that time Swami was moving around from town to town, he would do 6 weeks in San Francisco and maybe 3 times a year, or at most 4 times a year, he would repeat that class in San Francisco. Otherwise, it would be in Berkeley or in Palo Alto or other cities around San Francisco. So the only real contact I could have with him was by taking that class. So I took the class. The next time he offered it, I took it again. The next time he offered it, I took it again. And gradually he was building up. He could see that I was more interested than the other students. And gradually, as people were more connected with him, he started giving a satsang every Thursday night in his apartment. And I was talking with Dr. Chowdhury because he's recently learned to play the Madranga. Swamiji taught me to play a simple rhythm on the Madranga, and then it was my job to play the Madranga for all the chanting at the satsang. So the satsangs would be very like what we have now. Maybe there would be 15 minutes or 20 minutes of chanting. Then there would be a meditation for 15 or 20 minutes. Then Swami would give a short discourse, and then that would conclude the evening, but people would kind of hang around and just become friends. The only other person with our work now who came to those satsangs is Jayaji. He was a student at Berkeley, and he would occasionally make the trip across the bay and come to those satsangs. So he too was very early on. So then after about a year, so I met him in April of 1967. By about the summer of 1968, I was working in San Francisco as a social worker. And I was good at the job because I had a lot of compassion for people and I wanted to do a good job. But Swamiji asked me in that summer to become his assistant. He didn't have he had a few volunteers that would come and do a little bit of work here and there, but nothing consistent. And so he asked me to quit my job and become his assistant. And it was a big decision for me. You know, now we can look around and we see a whole big organization of Ananda, and we see that many people are employed or many people are able to make their way this way. But being the first, there was no model for that. But I had a very significant dream. I won't tell you the whole dream, but the end of it was that, well, I'll tell you the whole dream because it's an interesting dream, and it was extremely significant for me. and it changed my life. It was a super conscious dream. So in the dream, I was walking through a meadow, and I had a fishing pole. And I had, as a youth, I had enjoyed fishing. I used to fish with my father, and it was one of the ways that we shared. So I enjoyed that. But by the time I got into the adolescence, I didn't like hurting the fish. And so I gave up fishing. And so in this dream, I was carrying this fishing pole, and I came to a cave, and in the cave was an underground stream, or was a stream. And so I threw the line in, and immediately I caught a fish. And so when I looked at the fish, there's a particular, I used to pun all the time. I have to warn you. I have pretty much been cured of this. My friends over the years have worked patiently on this terrible habit of mine. And basically, they have cured me. It sprouts up once in a while, but not very often. But in this dream, probably the most significant dream of my life, there was a triple pun in that dream. And so this particular fish was a fish called a sunfish. It's a name for a fish that's common in America. And the hook was in its lips, and I was very carefully trying to take the hook out without hurting the fish. And in those days, there were posters. You've probably seen something of the sort, where there's the face of a sun, and the hair are rays of light coming out, and thick lips and rosy cheeks. Well, those thick lips, as I was taking the hook out of the fish's mouth, I saw that there were thick lips, and then I looked, and that sunfish had turned into the image of the sun. And then I looked again, and the fish had turned in to the baby Jesus, the Son of God, as he is known in the West. So sunfish became the Son of God. And Jesus, the baby, telepathically said to me, if you want to know what it's like to be a fish, you will never find out by sitting on the bank. And he turned back into a fish, flopped off my lap back into the stream, and swam away. Well, it was obvious to me. The meaning of the dream came along with the dream. If I wanted to find out what the life of a real yogi was, I could not find out by standing on the sidelines and observing that. I had to become a yogi. I had to commit. I had to go in. I also knew that that stream represented the energy of the spine. I had to enter into that energy. So, about a week after that dream, I accepted the job with Swami Kriyananda. And for the next 2.5 years, we basically did almost everything together. I would go to all of the classes. Gradually, as I became more adept, Swamiji would have me teach 1 or sometimes 2 classes out of that 6-week series, because that was the only way that he could get a night off, because he was working. The energy that he had, oh my. Even when he was elderly and frail, he could run about 12 people ragged just by being around him, sending people off. So it was very, very intense. He was writing, he was answering letters, he was teaching classes, and in the little apartment that he was in, we had a kind of a fancy mimeograph machine. It was called a Gestetner, but a fancy mimeograph machine. And we were printing his books in his apartment. Then we had a binder that bound them, and I would go around to bookstores to sell them, and we would sell them. He only had 1 or 2 books at the beginning, and we would take those to the classes and so on. But gradually, more and more was happening. In 1967, when I met him, I didn't know at that time, I found out a few months later, he had purchased the first land for Ananda, up near Ananda Village. For those of you who have visited the meditation retreat, he had purchased that land in an association with 4 other well-known spiritual teachers from the Bay Area. And so by 1968, end of 67 even, and 68, we began to visit that land and tried to do some of the first buildings and some of that activity. But it was always in his mind dedicated to be a meditation retreat, but also he wanted people to have a place that they could live together. Because in the back of his mind was the thought of cooperative communities, spiritual communities, which Master had urged him to do. And so he had that ideal. And so that began the growing of Ananda. And we both moved from San Francisco to Ananda Village in the spring of 1969. He was, for the most part, his activities were 3 at that time. They were teaching. He would give Sunday services every Sunday. Usually there would be a retreat where people would come and he would give Saturday classes. He did the whole thing. He would walk along in the morning with a mridanga or his guitar, and he would wake people up, walk around by the tents, because that's all we had. Then he would lead the meditation. Then he would, he didn't cook the food, somebody else did that, but he would give the class. In the afternoon, he would have appointments, talk to people. In the evening, he would often give a concert. Sunday, he would give a Sunday service. He was always with the guests, so it was like operating this as a one-man show. And he was constantly doing that. Then he would leave and give classes because he was still supporting everything through his classes. And he did that for about, and then by the weekend he would be back and again start the same cycle. And so he did that for about a year and a half, until the rest of us were able to take on the responsibility for paying for the mortgage on the property. I, at that time, was, because I had been Swami's assistant, I fell naturally into the role of being the manager for the community. And so my job was to do all of the organizational, whatever organization there wasn't much, but whatever there was, we were doing that organizational work and gradually building. And even in the first summer, lots and lots and lots of people came. Not many of them were yogis yet. Some of them became yogis, but most of them just liked the idea of, they heard that there was free land, that they could live, that somebody would take care of them. And lots of people, sometimes we had 5 or 6 cars arriving from different parts of America, coming in saying, hey man, it was the hippie era, hey man, I heard that you have homes for us to live in. Where's our home? We'd say, no, we don't, and we'd send them on. But nonetheless, there was a lot of that activity, but out of that came a number of people who were also very sincere. And so the community began to grow and grow. And that growth, so Swami's role in that was twofold primarily. First of all, he was the axis, he was the spine of the community. Other people were the hands and the feet, but he was the spine and the brain, and most importantly, he was the soul of the community. Because around his discipleship, around his commitment to the spiritual path, and he was an elevated soul, and everybody could recognize that. But he became the center at which we all began to try to shape our lives. Now, this was not without difficulty. This was America. The young people that were coming were, by and large, a little bit rebellious, and so not everybody fell into line with Swami. And if you hear him talk about those years, it's mainly about the battles that he had to fight with the people who were there who didn't understand. But gradually, more and more, we built a core of people so that by the time you've heard of the fire in 1976, by that time we had a little over 100 people living at the community, and maybe 125. And then the fire ended, wiped out all of those homes, so there was time of rebuilding. Then, about 10 years after the founding of the community, Swamiji felt it was time, because at that time Ananda was defined as just that one place. So it wasn't yet a movement, it was a place. And Swami knew that that wasn't Master's vision. And so by about 1969, the time came for Ananda to begin to spread out. And so Swami's idea was to establish communities, started as ashrams, but communities in urban areas, which is, I feel, going to be the model that will work here in India also. And so there was a very small one, just two people, one of them being Haridas, many of you know from Bangalore, and Vijay, who is now serving up in Rishikesh. Those two had a very small, just a little house in Sacramento. But then Swami decided that we should go to San Francisco. And so for about 3 months, a group of us, about 8 or 10 of us, lived in a little tiny 3-bedroom house. And Swami had a trailer outside, so he had his own little space. But it was very crowded, but it was what we could afford. But then Swami was giving satsangs every week and attracting people, and more people were coming, wanting to be a part of this. So we knew we had to find a bigger house. So we began looking for something that was bigger. In my mind, and I think in the mind of everyone else, it was probably a house maybe twice the size of this little 3-bedroom house. I think the rent of the 3-bedroom house was $350, which translated into rupees would be, I don't know, 20,000 rupees, something like that. And so we wanted to find a bigger house, and we began looking. And then somebody said, Swami, there's this very big house, really it's a mansion, and in San Francisco, they had something called designer showcases, where different designers, they would have a big house and different designers would come and fix up a room, kind of as advertising, and then the public would come and they would see all these beautifully decorated rooms and, you know, painted in full marble, and at any rate, it was interesting. But just kind of as a joke, this person said, we ought to go see that big house. And so a group of about 6 of us, Devi was there and a few others, we went to see that thinking this was a joke. Not to Swami. His mind was always about 10 times as expansive as ours. Now this was not a 3-bedroom house. This was a 44-room house on 4 different floors in the most expensive area of San Francisco. And Swamiji walked in and he looked around and he said, this feels like ours. So the rent went from $350 a month to $5,000 a month. And our first meeting, we tried to draw together people who might want to live together in that ashram. And there was one fellow who was a little dour, and he was sitting in the corner like this. And about every 5 minutes he would shake his head and said, "This is insanity." Go back to this. "This is insane." Go back. Anyway, as you can well imagine, within a couple of weeks, we had signed the documents and we took on that house. And at one time, then people began to arrive. And there were, Devi and I were there. Our son was 3 years old at the time. So for those of you who have families and think you can't do this kind of thing because you have children, our son was 3 years old and he was living with us. And within a year or so, we had about 30 people living in that ashram. And from there it grew, and then eventually we outgrew that, and the work moved down to a community in Palo Alto, which was down. But I don't want to go on in great detail. I just want to say that this phase began Swamiji's expansion out from the first property. And after that followed a community in Palo Alto, one in Sacramento, which had been started, and gradually more communities on the West Coast. Then came Italy about 10 years later, and then came India in 2003. So Ananda, from that one little one-bedroom apartment, has now spread around the world, really. And we have 10 communities, meaning places, residential communities, maybe 50 or so centers, meaning places where, not just in someone's home, but where there's a rented facility where classes and so on, just as we have the Pune City Center and elsewhere. And we have around the world maybe 150 or 200 meditation groups. And so if you were to see a map of Ananda in the world, there would be a lot of little points of light there, and there will be a lot more in the future. Oh well, I'll keep going. But all of it is due primarily to one thing. You know, we can talk about the organizational structure, we can talk about the spread, we can talk about all the numbers, but that is not the real work of Ananda. The real work of Ananda is to produce devotees and eventually to produce saints, to produce a life for those who are attracted to it, where one can dedicate one's life to God. And that is what Swamiji modeled for us. As you're going to see in the movie, he had this enormous hunger for a meaningful life. And it was when he met Master that the focus of that came into being. But he modeled for us the model of discipleship, where he was able to show us what a life dedicated to serving God, to seeking God, to thinking about God, to creating communities based on a life dedicated to God. He modeled all of that for us, but all of it was an extension of his own discipleship. He never thought of himself as the doer. He always thought of God as the doer, of Master as the doer. And he did, on a physical plane, he did more than 10 men could normally do. You all know 150 books, 450 pieces of music, thousands of lectures, and all of these communities. All of that compacted into one lifetime. One time, a man, Swami Shankarananda from Rishikesh visited Ananda. And he looked around and was amazed just seeing Ananda Village. And he said, how in the world could one man do this? because he'd also visited one of the Palo Alto community. How in the world could one man do this? And then he stopped and he said, oh, I know the secret. He didn't do it. God did it through him. And the consciousness, in fact, God does everything through us. The difference between Swamiji and us is that Swamiji was conscious of the fact that he was not the doer, that God was doing everything. And he gave all the credit back, but more than just giving the credit back, when we take ourselves out of the picture of being the doer, then our narrow little tiny hose becomes a pipe. And when we really realize that it's God as the doer, that pipe becomes a stream, or in the case of Master, a river. And that river can carry thousands, millions of people along the pathway to God. As we were talking yesterday, Master's great legacy is the autobiography of the yogi and all of the material that his lectures and lessons, but most of all, his legacy is the living representatives of his disciples that carry on that. Swamiji too, his real legacy is the people, and that includes many, many of you here who have aligned our lives, allowed our lives to be shaped by that consciousness of dedication to God and discipleship to a great master and a great path. And as we become aligned with God, then God's power can flow through us. Swami used often to use an illustration of magnetism. Master said, in fact, we're in the age of energy now. He said Treta Yuga is the age of magnetism. We'll understand that everything works according to magnetism. And so that magnetism, Swami used to describe a bar of iron where the molecules in that bar go every which way. And each little molecule has a north and south pole. And so those polarities cancel each other out because they're randomly aligned. But if you turn all of those molecules in one direction, then the north pole and the south pole of each molecule adds to the next one, and you have a bar that has a north and south polarity. It becomes a magnet. That can be done in two ways. One, by putting it next to another magnet, which is taking a bar of iron and putting it beside the guru, who molecules are aligned directionally toward God. Or it can be done by sending a strong electrical current through that bar of iron, and that aligns that. That's the practice of Kriya and our spiritual techniques. But both together, spiritual techniques and alignment with someone who is already more aligned is what magnetizes our consciousness, and then the thoughts naturally begin to flow toward God. The life naturally begins to express the desire to be aligned to God. And as that takes place over a long period of time with a lot of people, then a group forms like Ananda that Master and Babaji can send powerful energy through, and that magnetism sends out a carrier wave that if others are in tune with that, they feel that, they pick up the autobiography, they see a flyer, they go on. Somebody was just talking about us. He came because of Facebook. And then a year later, he took Kriya. So those carrier waves go out, and those who want that alignment somehow catch that, and that magnetism grows and grows and grows until Swamiji's dedication, Master's mission to this lifetime is to change the consciousness of the planet. And you and I are extremely, extremely fortunate to have a life where that mission is clear and that we have the opportunity to participate. Because Master said, the channel is blessed by that which flows through it. That little bar, little piece of now magnetized iron is blessed by the fact that there is energy flowing through it. So we have a wonderful opportunity and a beautiful mission. And so you will enjoy, I've told the second part of the story, you'll enjoy the first part of the story in the movie.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here in this temple and see the progress that's been made and the dedication that this represents to serving God and Guru. Since Jyotish began with sharing his first meetings with Swami, I will also share a few stories, but each one has a message for all of us. The actions of a great soul like Swamiji are never solely personal, even though he may be working with an individual, but there's always a principle underneath what he says to people, how he interacts with them. And yes, he gave us our spiritual life. He gave us a way to serve God, but he also made it clear that we had to step up. We had to take on the responsibility. It wasn't just a free gift. And I remember, I think I came in July 4th, 1969. I came to Ananda Village. And the next spring, Swami came up to me and he said, I hadn't had much personal interaction with him at all. And I'll talk about that more later. But he just came up to me totally as a surprise, and he said, I'm going to give you the name Devi, and it means Divine Mother. Then his face became very serious, and he said, and you'd better live up to it. And I knew what he was saying. It was these blessings, if you don't take them seriously, if you don't take your Kriya initiation seriously, if you don't take discipleship seriously, and so, oh yes, I'm a disciple off and on, when it's convenient. When there's a big event, maybe I'll come. But other than that, I have my own life to live. We have a responsibility. If we want to really draw from what the gurus are giving us. Another story, early on in my days with Swami, in those days I was living very simply at the meditation retreat. And one day I had, and on Thursdays it was always a day of silence and fasting. And so I was coming from the temple, it was mid-afternoon, and then Swami and two other people, one was Jyotish and another person drove up and got out of the car. And I had just been meditating and in silence, so my mind was very interiorized. And I looked at Swamiji, and he was wearing a very pretty, sort of a sky blue pullover sweater, very pretty color. But there was so much light coming out of him. It was like his aura was immense. And I was so young and foolish, I just looked at him and I said, Swami, what a beautiful sweater you're wearing. And it had nothing to do with the sweater, it was the light emanating from him. And he just smiled at me. But then the other person with Swami made a little sarcastic remark. And I don't know why, but she did. And as soon as she did that, the light was gone. Not from Swami, but my perception of it was gone. And so what was the lesson there? We have to be so careful in expressing negativity, criticism, sarcasm, because it shuts off the light within us and the light that other people are receiving. And in Swami's presence, that little bit of negativity, it was very impressive to me. And I realized, oh, one little sarcastic word and the light is gone. And so again, as part of our spiritual path, even if we're provoked, yesterday someone asked the question, Gorgia asked the question, well, what if people are unkind? What do we do then? And of course you have to respond, but in a way that you don't pull down your energy. And then the third story I'll tell you, and then I'd like to share more about watching Swami's discipleship evolve. But in this story, again, it took place in the early years of my time at Ananda. I was living in a little bitty, like a 6-foot caravan, little trailer, 12-foot, I guess it was. But I was meditating in the morning, and then the little trailer was just in the woods somewhere. And then I was walking up to the dining room for breakfast. And Swami happened to be, I could see him, he was about as far away as I am from the very back of the room. And he was talking with 2 other men. They were pointing at the big water tower. And so I think it was something about fixing the water tower. And they were all looking at the water tower. And I was just quietly walking, that distance, and I didn't catch their eye. I didn't say, oh, hello. I was just quietly walking my way, and Swami's back was to me. And at a certain point, I saw he just turned around, and he walked over to me. He left that discussion, and I had, that morning, had a very deep communion with Master, and he just took my hands, and he said, very good. How did he know? How did he know what had happened? And he picked it up with his back to me. He was engaged in a conversation. He was not close to me. But what's the lesson there? The Guru is always watching our sincere efforts, and he's blessing them, and he's acknowledging them. So don't think, oh, what difference does it make if I meditate or I don't meditate? The Guru was always saying, come. I see your efforts. I acknowledge them. I bless them. And so it was with Swamiji. He was always very, I could tell you more stories, but I don't want it just to be my stories. I want it to be more Swami's story. But there were many times where the least little sigh, the least little thought, that I had no idea he could perceive that, and he would respond to that. And so again, Master said, I know every thought you're thinking. I don't know if Swami knew every thought that we had been thinking, but he certainly knew many, and he demonstrated that he knew. And does that make you afraid? Oh my gosh, he knows all my thoughts, and I have bad thoughts and good thoughts. No, because if you accept, he knows my negativity, all the bad traits that I have, but he also knows my sincere spiritual effort, and his love is unconditional. That's the point. Don't be afraid to open yourself up fully and completely. Don't think you can hide from God any aspect of your consciousness, because he's already inside you and he's on your side. But we will see in the movie, which we'll see later this afternoon, when Master met Swamiji, he said, your work in this life is writing, editing, and lecturing. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how I saw Swamiji do those things. First, we'll start with lecturing, because that was more my first contact with him. When I came to Ananda Retreat, as Jyotish said, Swami would do the whole weekend, leading the meditations, leading the classes, the chanting. But his lectures, I came from an educated background. I had very fine teachers throughout my life, but I had never heard anyone who had the scope and the breadth and the depth of understanding of truth and reality as Swami did. And fortunately, we live in an age where most of his talks have been recorded. And so you all can enjoy these talks. When I listen to some of these old talks from what we call treasures along the path from 30, 40 years ago, I remember being there. I remember hearing that talk. But I also am keenly aware that I was just skimming the surface of what he was saying. When I hear them now, after more years of meditation under my spiritual belt, so to speak, I realize, oh my gosh, I did not at all understand what he was really saying. So we can listen and listen. But in those days, he would weave in history and literature and science and art, and you never knew where he was going. And then in the end, he would bring it all together, and with such power that you just felt like a burst of spiritual energy had exploded in your brain. Very often when I was new, I had to go and lie down after one of his talks because I felt my brain just couldn't take anymore. I had to just kind of like digest it and let it absorb into my being. And we watched him over the years as his discipleship grew, as his service and the scope of Ananda grew, and as he aged, when often he was unwell. Once he was giving some lectures across America, and he called them the Joy Tours. And we happened to be in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Swami became quite ill. He had a really high fever, and he really could not get out of bed. And so he asked Jyotish if he would give the talk, and of course he said yes. And I said, Swami, I'll stay with you because you're not well, and somebody needs to be here. And he said, okay. And so he was very high fever, and I was bringing him tea and things to drink, and I putting a cold cloth on his head. And at a certain point, and this was 1978, so it was not, that long into his life, he said, I feel like an old war horse that's been worn out in all the battles, but he still had 40 years to go from that point. So that war horse picked himself up and kept going and going. And we saw him time after time. He would have a bad flu or something, and we would say, Swamiji, please don't give the lecture. And he would say, no, I must go. Once he was giving a lecture when we were getting the work started in Italy. There was a small group of devotees in the city of Paris, France, and they said, oh, Swami, will you come do a lecture here? And he agreed on his way to Italy. But he had no support team there. So Diane and I took the train. It was a pretty third class, pretty horrendous experience because it was all we could afford. But we met Swamiji, and they had rented a hall about this big, but they hadn't done any publicity whatsoever. Swami got off the plane. Again, he was sick. He had a bad flu. And so we went to this hall, and nobody came. Finally, one man walked in. And Diana and I said, Swami, please go back to your hotel room. We will talk to the man. You need to rest. And Swami said, no, he came to hear me talk about my guru, and I will talk with him. So the two of them sat in the front row, and Swami talked for an hour to this man about how he met his guru, what his teachings were, and I don't think we ever saw that man again. I'm sure we didn't. But Swami was fulfilling his promise. Master told him, your job in this world is to lecture. And he did it. But then at the end of his life, I would say in the last 6 or 7 years, his lecturing changed. His mind became more and more focused. Guruji, Guru, Guru, Guru. And he didn't the mental aspect of it, the literature and the art and the science, all that fell away. And over and again, he would just talk about Master. And in the last year or two, he just had to talk about Master, and he would just weep. That was all that was left. All the education, all the interesting sidelights and analogies, all that was left was how I met my Guru and how much I love my Guru. And that's the fruit of a life of discipleship. And then Master told him to write. And I remember when I came in 1969, as Jyotish said, he would lecture all during the week all over the cities in Northern California, and then come to the meditation retreat. But then on Sunday afternoon and evening, that was his time to write before he left again to lecture. And what was he writing then? What is now the art and science of Raja Yoga. Started out as 14 steps to perfect joy, was it? No, it started perfect joy, and then I think it went to higher awareness. But in any case, so he would be writing that. And it was so filled. He wanted to pour everything into it: philosophy, yoga postures, meditation, diet, philosophy, everything. It was so rich. People say to us now, if you could have one manual on the art and science of Raja Yoga, everything is in that book. And when did he write it? In the few hours he had after finishing a big weekend and then going out to lecture. And these were in the days of, he had a little Selectric typewriter, a little portable typewriter. We have it now still in his apartment, which we have made into a shrine at Ananda Village. That little typewriter is there that he typed so many of those books on. And just the richness of what he wrote. And then he wrote other smaller works, but then he began writing The Path, which later entitled The New Path. And by this time he was living at his dome over at Ananda Village, but he would just, unrelenting. He wasn't going out teaching anymore, but he was writing and writing and writing nonstop. But then he did two things which were so wonderful. I believe it was Wednesday night, he would call whoever was living meditation retreat at the village, and we would come over to his house, and he would say, I want to read the next chapter. I want you to hear the next chapter. And each one was just so beautiful. And then after he'd finished, and we were just in awe, he would say, do you have any thoughts or suggestions? And we felt so inadequate. What could we possibly say? But again, he didn't want us to say, oh, that was wonderful, Swami. He would say, what do you think? Do you have any ideas? Again, he was trying to train us. Think things through clearly. Don't just take it what I do, but you too will be writing. You too will be sharing teachings. You need to not just be passively receiving, but to dynamically listen and analyze and see what you could add to it. And so he would get a little upset with us if we didn't have some comments about it. And we never knew beforehand, so we couldn't prepare. So while he was reading, we were thinking, okay, what can I say, what can I say? And he liked it. He liked it when we had comments. But I remember one time, again, always in the midst of his intense focus, he always was aware of other people. And one time, when he was writing The Path on his little typewriter, someone was supposed to bring him his mail every day. The mail, we have a central mail delivery, and the person who ordinarily did it was away, and they said, can you bring him his mail? So I brought the mail. But I happened to be, unfortunately, in a mood. They happen, the details aren't important, but I was discouraged, I was spiritually downcast, I wasn't inspired. Part of my mind was saying, maybe this isn't the life for you. It was a bad period. And that was the day someone said, can you bring Swami his mail? He was in silence. so he couldn't talk. And we knew we weren't supposed to talk to him when we brought the mail. So I just brought it, put it on his table, started to leave. No, I think I was still standing by him. So I put the mail there, and he went like this. And he took out the paper out of the typewriter he was working on, took a little piece of notepaper. I remember it was a little sheet of blue paper, put it in the typewriter, and began typing, took it out, handed it to me. And it said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." That was all. And I just took it. Unfortunately, it burnt up in the fire, so I don't have it anymore. But that's what he gave me. In the midst of his deep concentration, he knew what I needed in that moment, and he gave that. And then he finished the path. Let's see how much time I've got. I get a little bit. And then he began touring and talking about it. But writing the path was a turning point in his discipleship, because up to that time, because of the separation with Self-Realization Fellowship, he was always not wanting to put his discipleship and his role with Master out too much. But with the path, he made his declaration. I am a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. I was personally trained by him. I was commissioned by him with a great work, and he said, "You have a great work to do." So that was a wonderful, thrilling thing to see Swami step out of the shadows and step into his mission that Master had given him. And then we'll skip ahead a bit to, this is more of an amusing story. When he was writing, composing, I should say, the beautiful oratorio that after a visit to the Holy Land, and he was living in a house. His house was being painted, I think. So he was living in a little guest house right nearby. He was in seclusion, and he was just composing. Whatever he did, that's all he did. And then one evening, he wanted to relax a little bit, so he called a few of us over for dinner, to have dinner with him. But his mind was so focused on composing. When we came in and sat down, when he looked at us, it was like, I could tell he couldn't relate to who we were. And I said to Jyotish, it was like he was looking at us saying, "Is she a C sharp or a B flat?" And it was a very elevated experience, but you could just feel that his mind had been totally elsewhere. And then I'll just skip ahead. He wrote, so we talked of lecturing, we talked of writing, but Master also said editing. And the first major book he edited was Master's commentaries on the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which is beautiful. Master speaks of it often in Autobiography of a Yogi, and how that poem is a deep mystical poem and deeply misunderstood as just like a love poem. It's not what it is at all. But so he did the Rubaiyat, but then what he always wanted to write, because Master had worked with him on this, was to help with the editing of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. And at one point, we were able to see Master's original manuscript, and you could see Swami's comments written on the sides of the pages from, many, many years ago. But he didn't have a copy of the manuscript. So how could he edit what he worked on with Master in his desert retreat? And you'll see this in the movie. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful how it's depicted. But he had a dream. And it's so moving. In the dream, Master came to him and he said, "Master, I want to finish the work you gave me to do of editing the essence of the Gita, but how can I do it without a manuscript to work from?" And Master said, "Don't forget the possibility of a skylight." you know, that's like a window in the roof where the light can come in. And Swami said, what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. But then he came to India, 2003, began teaching here, getting Ananda established. And then the miracle happened. The skylight opened, and he said he could remember every verse and every, maybe not word for word, but the essence of the commentary that Master had given on every verse of the Gita. And we were there in Gurgaon when he began. This was 2009, I believe. And we arrived, and he graciously found a little room on the roof for us to stay in his house. And he said, I'm going to be working on the Gita, and it has to have my full focus now. And we said, we understand, Swamiji. We don't want to interrupt your flow by any means. And he said, my goal is to write 10 pages a day. And I don't know how long the book will be. I don't know how long it will take me. But he began. And the little room we were staying on was right outside his office. So we could see in the middle of the night when the light went on. And very often it would go on at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we knew he was in there. By this time it was computers. He was writing on the computer. And every day he would come down in the morning and he would say, would you like to hear what I've written? Just as he did with the path. And we said, oh, yes, Swami. And it was so fresh and so inspiring and beautiful. Some days he would write 10 pages, some days 20 pages, but never less than 10. And the book grew and grew. And it was such a blessing to be around him at that time, because he was so filled with Master's presence. And we didn't want to talk with him too much, although he never wanted people to be stiff around him. So he would go out to lunch and go out to dinner, but we could feel, just as he was composing the oratorio, his mind was always on the Gita, always on the Gita. And then we left after a month and a half. He hadn't yet completed it, but then in 2 months he completed this 600-page commentary. And there's a picture of him when our wonderful head of our publishing house, Sangita, gave him the printed copy. And there was a picture of him holding that book, and he did it. He did what Master had given him to do against all odds. Oh, we have our wonderful guest coming. Against all obstacles. He had finished, he had lectured, he had edited, he had written, but more than anything, he had shared through all of that Master's love. In the midst of all the activity, it was just him being a channel for that love that Master had given him and that had changed his life and that he gave to all of us to change our life. So we could talk many, many days about Swamiji and share many, many stories, but we will let the movie inspire you. And Kavita, the producer of the movie, has just arrived. We're just concluding here, and then we'll take a little break. We're so happy you could come, Kavita. This is a beautiful event, and I think you'll be pleased with how they've set it up. So I guess the only thing to say is, what a life in God and Guru have given us. And as Swami said to me, and we'd better live up to it. Jai Guru.